Hi everybody, this is Jeff from Robotics, and today I'm going to be discussing some critical upgrades I think everyone should consider for their Tronxy P802MA 3D printer. Let's get started. For this upgrade, you'll need the following tools and components. You're going to need a piece of corkboard, some Kapton tape, a Mosfet, some extra wiring, 2 spade connectors, and about 6 ring terminals. You can use the open or the closed. I'm using the closed because that's what I had on hand. 2 pieces of shrink wrap tubing and a 20 amp switch. You're also going to want some solder, a ruler, and a Sharpie marker. After removing your heat bed, you're going to want to lay down your corkboard and set the heat bed upside down on top of the corkboard. I go ahead and just square it up with a corner. Now I take my Sharpie and I just trace the edges. And where the wiring's at, I go ahead and just put a couple of little notches here, because we're going to be needing that measurement later. Then you can remove the heat bed. Now for this notch, we'll go ahead and just add that. So we'll take our ruler and we can see that our notch needs to be about 1 centimeter down. So I'll line this up here. And now we have our notch. This doesn't need to be exact, but it should at least be big enough so that we aren't interfering with the wiring and connections. Next, we'll take our X-Acto knife and go ahead and cut this shape out. So I'm going to go ahead and take this ruler and I'm going to mark where the screw hole should be now. So we have 21 centimeters from hole to hole and 21 centimeters on this side. We'll make sure everything is just square. One more. So now we have all of our holes marked and we can proceed to cutting them out. I'm not going to do a round hole, I'm going to do a puncture instead. That way it's a tight fit around the screws. Now we should be able to take this and push it right through the holes. You want to do this rather slowly so that it doesn't damage the corners. Now that we've got our cork board on here, we can go ahead and reattach it with our washers and nuts. Chances are your Tronxy printer also came covered in blue painter's tape on the heat bed. I like blue painter's tape just fine. It's great for masking, it's great for painting stuff. However, when it comes to 3D printing, I've never had good luck with it. I don't trust it, I don't like it, so the first thing I'm going to do is peel all of it off and get rid of it. Now that we've got all that nasty painter's tape off of the heat bed, take some isopropyl alcohol and just put a little bit on there and clean this off real well. And we'll let that dry for a couple of minutes. So if you're using a roll of Kapton tape like this, it pulls really hard. So what I do is I put a piece of blue painter's tape underneath it. That way it's easy to pull off without really damaging the tape. We'll just squeegee this down. Try to get rid of all the bubbles. And that's it for our heat bed upgrade. Now we can go ahead and put everything back and tighten down the heat bed and get ready to level it. If you haven't checked out my video for my method of leveling the heat bed platform, please check it out right here. To install our Mosfet, we're going to need the following things. We'll need our Mosfet, of course. We'll need a bit of extra wire, 4 ring terminals, the connection wire that came with the Mosfet, a bit of heat shrink tubing, some solder, some strippers really help, a screwdriver, and then of course a soldering iron as well. I thought I'd just use this pictorial diagram to show you what connections we're going to be wiring into. So according to the original plan, the hotbed goes into this second terminal down, the second green terminal down, and that powers the heat bed, while the second white terminal up from the bottom will regulate the temperature on the heat bed. So these two are normally connected right into the heat bed of the board. However, we're going to be putting this Mosfet in place. Here's another electrical diagram of how we're going to be connecting the Mosfet to the Melzi board. Here we have our power side, and here we have our hotbed side, and this is where the temperature thermistor will be plugged in. So our DC in will be going here, plus and negative. Our actual heat bed will be plugged into these two, and then our thermistor will be plugged in to here. We'll begin by stripping the wires. The first thing that we'll do before we solder is make sure that the wires are tinned properly. So I'm going to be using this tinning solution here. This is number 5 lead-free solder paste. Now we'll take our solder and tin each wire. going to take our heat shrink tubing and make sure that we have enough room for both sides of the solder connection to fit underneath it comfortably. Move that off there. Again. You can just add this on here now. Now we'll simply pull the heat shrink up over the solder connections and heat them up a little bit. There we go. Now that our solder connections are all made, we can go ahead and add our first 2 ring terminals. Once we've got our wire ring terminals attached, we can go ahead and screw them into the Mosfet. So the heat bed should go where it says heat bed, and our power supply goes to the DC in, positive and negative. Here is where we will plug in our thermistor, and here is where the heat bed is plugged in. After installing the 4 ring terminals onto the power supply and onto the heat bed, we can then proceed to plug in the thermistor as I showed you in the diagram. I'm using a 3D printed bracket that I found on Thingiverse, and this will actually be shown in the description below. So in order to add a switch to our power supply, we're just going to follow this schematic that I've drawn up here. We have our power supply unit, we have our plug, and we have our switch. And most power cables come with a green wire, a black wire, and a white wire. Although on my printer it actually came with a brown wire, a blue wire, and a green wire. Just a quick note, I am in the United States, so I use the United States style plug. And if you're in the UK or a country that uses a different style of plug, you're certainly going to have to make the appropriate modifications to this design here. So we have our switch, we have our wires, and this is the plug here. To wire up our power switch, we're just going to need these things. We obviously need our power cord. We need 2 spade connectors, 1 ring connector, our power switch, a small bit of wire, and it helps if you have some wire strippers and crimpers. We're just going to take the black wire and add a spade connector. And go ahead and crimp that down. Take an additional short piece of wire, add a spade connector to that. Add your ring terminal to the other end of your short bit of wire. And now our wire is ready to be connected to the switch. Now that we've got all of our wires set up, we can go ahead and install the wires onto our switch. I inserted my switch into this 3D printed box just to hold it a little bit better, and use the double-sided adhesive on the side That way I have a place to mount it. Once I come up with a completed design for this, I'll post the files on Thingiverse so that an appropriate power switch can be used for this module. This is the power supply that came with the Tronxy in our kit, and that was a 12 volt, 20 amp, 250 watt power supply. From the very beginning, I had nothing but problems with this power supply. Even after adding the Mosfet, I had serious power problems with this. It didn't allow the heat bed or the extruder to heat up very fast, and when I finally cranked up the power supply to provide the correct amount of voltage required to heat up the heat bed, it only lasted for about a week before it actually burned out. If we go ahead and remove the top cover, I can show you my problem. You can see here that the thermistor burned out because of overcurrent, and that definitely shouldn't have happened. This power supply is clearly made very cheaply and for the purpose of just getting a power supply into the printer unit. I do not recommend using this power supply at all. It is a very known problem. There are various videos and forums that indicate that they had problems with their power supply as well. So my recommendation is to actually just get rid of this power supply or use it for spare parts, and do not even attempt to use it with your Tronxy printer. Even if you're printing a filament with very low temperatures, unless you aren't going to be using the heat bed at all, I would recommend not using this power supply. In at least one case, I watched a video on YouTube that the gentleman putting this printer together used this power supply, and it not only failed, but it continuously tripped the breakers in his house. This was a problem that I was aware of at the beginning of building this printer, but I thought I would give it the benefit of the doubt and attempt to use this power supply anyway, which to my dissatisfaction obviously did not work very well. This is the power supply I replaced the stock power supply with. As you can see, this is a 12 volt 30 amp power supply, and it is a 360 watt. Now, even though this says it's an LED power supply, it has worked very, very well in this printer. This one is much more suitable for this printer. The only issue that I ran into was mounting the power supply. It didn't want to sit flat against the printer, so I needed to take advantage of these two holes to mount the power supply. And even though it does sit just a little crooked from the printer, it still gives quite a good profile. In fact, you can see that it doesn't even stick out that much. I won't go through the hassle of describing how to actually unhook and reconnect the old power supply and the new one, since they're obviously exactly the same. Just make sure you connect your positives to positives and negatives to negatives and install it pretty much exactly the way you installed the original one, and you should be good to go. Alright, so now that all of that's together, all we need to do is level our bed up and give it a test drive. Alright guys, that's all of the upgrades for this session here. I think these 5 upgrades are indeed critical for the Tronxy P802MA 3D printer in order to get a reasonable amount of safety and good print quality. And speaking of print quality, I went ahead and just printed this overhang sensor here, and it's actually the same sensor I use to print in my bed leveling video, which I talked about earlier. Like I said, these are all actually pretty inexpensive upgrades and relatively easy to do. I do have some other improvements that I am making on the printer and other suggestions, but these are the ones that I consider critical for this printer. If you guys would like to see another video regarding more upgrades and other steps that I've taken to enhance the build quality of this printer, please let me know in the comments. Also, if you guys found any of this helpful, let me know. If you guys have any tips or modifications, suggestions, or if you just plain old don't think that any of these upgrades work, let me know in the comments, because I'm always learning, always trying to improve on what I do. Everybody wants good quality out of their 3D printer. So if this video was helpful to you guys, give me a thumbs up. If you hated this video, if you hated these upgrades, if you think I suck at doing 3D printer videos, give me a thumbs down. Either way, your feedback is really important to me, so leave me a comment down below. Anyway, that is all that I have for today. Thank you so much for watching, guys. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, please hit that subscribe button and hit the bell notification so that you are informed every time I make a new video. That's all that I have for today. We'll see you next time.